Good. Hey, how's it going, guys? Mr. Binder here. Um, we took a look at aerobic respiration, and that included four stages that we specifically talked about. We spoke about glycolysis, we spoke about pyruvate oxidation, Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, and then moving on, the final stage is electron transport chain. Now, the whole purpose of these four stages is to produce NADH and FADH2, but also to produce ATP. Remember, ATP is the energy currency of the cell. ATP is required for chemical reactions that are occurring inside of our cells. Now, remember, glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain each have their own location. All right, that occurs inside of the cell. Glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm, pyruvate oxidation inside the matrix, as well as the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. And then finally the electron transport chain, which occurs on the cristae or the inner mitochondrial membrane of the mitochondria. You need to remember these locations. They're very, very important. To understand anaerobic respiration, it is a different stage or process that occurs. What happens in anaerobic respiration when oxygen is not available to the cell? Remember, oxygen is the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain to make the bulk ATP. Anaerobic respiration, there is no oxygen available in the cell, meaning that oxygen cannot be the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain. Well, that will change what happens to pyruvate. Remember, in the slides for aerobic respiration, I specifically talked about two pathways in which pyruvate can take. One is to go inside the mitochondrial matrix, where pyruvate oxidation, Krebs cycle, and ETC will take place, right? Well, inside the mitochondria anyways. But pyruvate can take a different path if oxygen is not present. And that pathway is anaerobic respiration. Oxygen is not present in the cell. Now, this could be maybe someone sprinting. You know, when you're sprinting fast speed, you're using actually your creatine phosphate pathway, which we discussed first off, and that's only good for about 60 seconds. All right, and then your muscles will start to produce lactic acid or lactate. All right, and this is what's known as the anaerobic respiration. You cannot provide your cells, your muscle cells, with enough oxygen in order to make, or in order for the aerobic respiration pathway to occur. At this point in time, as you're sprinting, and you could be sprinting away from, let's say, some scary ghost that it's Halloween time, so who knows, right? You know, you're all scared and this and that, and next thing you know, someone spooks you as you're going trick or treating, and next thing you know, I gotta sprint. So you're sprinting, and then my legs hurt. Well, why do my legs hurt? Okay, the whole process here is the fact that your muscles are using as much, well, all the oxygen that is currently in your muscle cells. When that oxygen runs out, your cells will then jump to an anaerobic respiration pathway. And that occurs in the cytoplasm of our cells, specifically our muscle cells. All right, so things to remember here is oxygen is not present. Understand that. But what else happens? The pyruvate that was produced as a result of glycolysis will not travel into the mitochondria. What will happen is pyruvate will stay out in the cytoplasm and be converted to lactic acid or lactate. Okay? Again, this happens during vigorous muscle exercise. Once our sprint's over and we can finally breathe and get oxygen back to our cells will start to produce ATP via the aerobic respiration pathway. That lactate that was produced as a result of an anaerobic pathway will travel through the blood to the liver, where it will get converted back to glucose, okay? And this is known as gluconeogenesis. That glucose will then work its way back into the bloodstream and back to the cells where it is needed for ATP, or for aerobic respiration. Again, lactic acid fermentation, it occurs in humans. We will talk about ethanol fermentation, and that does not occur in humans, and we cannot produce our own alcohol. You know, obviously LCBO will be closed if we could. But taking a look here, lactic acid fermentation, it occurs in humans. All right, and what's happening here? Well, we've got a glucose molecule. And remember, glycolysis does not require oxygen in order for that stage to take place. So Having said that, glycolysis takes place. All right, 2 ATP to start the whole process, and as an end result, we have 2 pyruvate molecules. Well, those 2 pyruvate molecules, instead of moving into the mitochondria when oxygen is present, it will stay outside in the cytoplasm. It will become reduced, right? So, oil rig, remember, pyruvate is reduced to lactate, right? To lactate. All right, so NADH is actually being oxidized here, okay? Is being oxidized as a result of this reaction, okay? Glycolysis will be able to continue because as a result of lactic acid fermentation, 2 ATP will be produced. The 2 ATP that will be produced will be used to continue glycolysis. Okay. Here's the reaction. Pyruvate plus NADH plus H gives you NAD plus lactate. Okay, glycolysis included. Notice the production here, 2 ATP. All right, the 2 ATP will actually be used to start glycolysis over again. So instead of the 36 to 38 ATP that are produced as a result of the aerobic pathway, here, the anaerobic pathway, we only see about 2 ATP being produced, which is not as efficient as the aerobic pathway. Okay. Anaerobic respiration, alcohol fermentation. Okay, again, like I said, this does not occur in human cells. All right, this occurs in yeast cells. And yeast is very important for beer makers and wine makers and whiskey makers because yeast is the organism that will actually undergo alcohol fermentation. All right, yeast are examples of facultative anaerobes. All right, now what that means is that yeast can, in fact, in the presence of oxygen, survive, whether they have it or not. Okay, what yeast will do is convert 2 molecules of pyruvate. Right? Remember, glycolysis is a primitive process. It occurs in all organisms. Okay, yeast cells will convert pyruvate as a product of glycolysis into ethanol. Ethanol is the molecule which we would find booze in. Okay. The same process occurs here. Glucose, all right, as a result, 2 ATP are produced. The pyruvate will become reduced as a result of the NADH here being oxidized. All right, we know that taking a look here, the product here is carbon dioxide, okay, as a result of the conversion of pyruvate to ethanol. All right, there's a precursor molecule, okay, acetaldehyde, which is then converted to ethanol. Okay. Again, alcohol fermentation. This is your bacteria or your yeast. All right. Pyruvate is decarboxylated. That means that a carbon dioxide molecule is released from the pyruvate molecule. Okay, as you can see here, it releases. And it makes sense because if you're making your own wine at home or your own beer and you need yeast to activate the gases or basically the conversion of this pyruvate into ethanol, you're going to get bubbles. So winemakers, they would put a bubbler on top of, let's say, a demijohn or a carboy or something that would hold your sugary juices that will eventually get turned into ethanol. Okay, so that carbon dioxide needs to escape. All right. NAD plus, all right, is reduced to NADH as a result of glycolysis. But as pyruvate goes through the path here to ethanol, a precursor molecule, acetaldehyde, is produced. That NADH will then reduce acetaldehyde. All right, so acetaldehyde is gaining electrons, and it will eventually be converted into ethanol. Okay. Final reaction here. Okay, glycolysis included. Remember, as a result of glycolysis, 2 pyruvate molecules are produced. All right. Again, only 2 ATP are produced as a result of ethanol fermentation. There's another class, I guess, of organisms that I'd like to talk about. We did discuss obligate aerobes. Right? Humans are an example of obligate aerobes. Yeast is an example of facultative anaerobes. Now we have our obligate anaerobes. And obligate anaerobes cannot survive in the presence of oxygen. These are your single-celled organisms, mostly your bacteria. Right? They lack a mitochondria. They do have an electron transport chain, but instead of oxygen being their final electron acceptor, they use an inorganic molecule. Okay, so sulfate, nitrate, iron. All right. What I want you to know about this is that, yeah, obligate anaerobes cannot survive in the presence of oxygen. Okay, you do not need to know the specific pathway that an obligate anaerobe uses to produce its own energy. This is something that I would like to discuss. This is an alternative of making energy. Again, remember, glucose, all right, is oxidized and it's in our cells to produce ATP. Well, it's known as a controlled oxidation. Okay, it's controlled because we want to capture as much energy from a glucose molecule as possible to store as ATP. Well, there are cells in our body that will produce heat rather than ATP. All right, and this is to help maintain internal body temperatures, especially when your tissues or your body is cold, okay, or when you're exposed to colder temperatures. All right. Instead of an ATP synthase producing ATP, now you take a look at this picture down here. The hydrogen ions that are, or the gradient of hydrogen ions, the proton gradient that's produced, okay, in between the outer membrane and the inner membrane of the mitochondria, okay, instead of going to the ATP synthase, it will actually use what's known as an uncoupling protein. This uncoupling protein will produce heat rather than ATP. This is important for mammals, okay, or hibernating mammals mostly, because they require, well, they sleep or hibernate during the winter time, so they require essentially thermogenesis. They need to maintain their internal temperature, okay, throughout the cold season, okay, and they do this by thermogenesis. The type of tissue that produces this energy would be your brown adipose tissue. All right, there are two different types of adipose tissue: white adipose tissue and brown adipose tissue. Brown adipose tissue is responsible for thermogenesis, or creating heat. And as a result of this heat, okay, that is created, mammals can maintain their internal temperature while they're hibernating. Young children also have it. Again, so do adults. And if you take a look at this picture up here, brown adipose tissue is mostly located around your internal organs. Okay, and it is, as we can see here, a lean thermoneutral person here. We don't see the activation of this brown adipose tissue creating heat. But when the same person is exposed to cold, we see that the brown adipose tissue is being activated and thermogenesis is created. And this would help to maintain internal temperatures. Again, you know, when our internal temperature is decreased, there is a chance that our body could go into shock and we can die. What our body naturally tries to do is create heat. And this brown adipose tissue is an example of one way in which our body can create heat. Again, alternatives to glucose. This is going to be a test question. Please understand that glucose is not the only molecule that will be used to create ATP. We have a variety of molecules. Again, we took a look at them in Chapter 1, the macromolecules. And again, these are the examples that I'm using, okay, as alternatives to glucose. Disaccharide carbohydrates. Okay, these are your two monosaccharides put together. All right, basically what happens is they are hydrolyzed into glucose, fructose, galactose. All right, they enter what's known as a pentose phosphate pathway. Okay, glycogen is hydrolyzed by enzymes in the liver, and the product is glucose 6-phosphate. All right, fats, again, generally speaking, your triglycerides, they are hydrolyzed into glycerol and your fatty acids. All right, glycerol is converted into glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, which is something that would be entered into glycolysis. Fatty acids, they're split into 2 carbon fragments. They become acetyl groups, okay, which attaches to CoA. That would be your pyruvate oxidation stage. Proteins, they're hydrolyzed into amino acids. Amino acids is the subunit for all proteins. The amino group is removed, and the rest, the central carbon and the carboxyl group, is entered as pyruvate or acetyl groups. Again, pyruvate would entering the stage as pyruvate. The next stage would be pyruvate oxidation, and then finally Krebs cycle. Amino acids actually have the ability to enter as intermediate molecules that are involved in the Krebs cycle, which is something that you don't have to know, but it is nice to kind of understand that. Okay. So this is a test question. I would hope that you would study this slide. It is very important because I will ask you, hey, are there alternatives to glucose? And you're going to say, yeah, Mr. Binder, there are. And I'm like, hey, what three were discussed on the slides? And you're going to say disaccharide carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. You're going to tell me what they are converted into and at what stage of aerobic respiration are they kind of put into. Okay? So if you have any questions about anaerobic respiration, please go back and watch the slides again. But if not, come to class. I will be here to support you with any questions that you do have. All right, take care.